Hi, I'm Tom Weaver, and we're about to watch the Attack of the Giant Leeches pre-credit sequence. Pre-credit sequences weren't common in 30s and 40s horror pictures, but long about the late 1950s, they started popping up with some regularity. Roger Corman's The Brain Eaters, and especially Not of This Earth, both had good ones. Before we see the title of Roger and Gene Corman's Night of the Blood Beast, we see the rocket taking off. Even the down and dirty backyard movie makers of that era started providing them regularly. Astounding She-Monster, Giant Gila Monster, Hideous Sun Demon, Frankenstein's Daughter. Queen of Outer Space had a 15-minute pre-credits sequence. It takes so long for the opening credits to run, you've completely forgotten that they haven't run. This, I'd say, is a pretty weak opener. We see what has to be an unoccupied leech costume on the surface of the water, with somebody under it making it undulate. The poacher puts a few slugs in it, and then takes a slug out of his jug. Not a great beginning, but that's appropriate, since Giant Leeches also does not have a great middle or a great end. As probably everybody who will buy this Film Masters Blu-ray and listen to this commentary knows, the monster scenes in this movie are nothing to write home about, with the exception of the grotto scenes. For the third time in a very short stretch of time, 50s monster kids heard the upcoming Alexander Laszlo music and watched this movie's title appear a few words at a time the same way that it does in the then recent Night of the Blood Beast. Musicologist David Schechter of Monsters Movie Music, which is mmmrecordings.com, tells me that he's led to believe that Laszlo wrote this Nova chord heavy cue for Blood Beast and reused it in Giant Leeches and Beast from Haunted Cave. But we don't know if Laszlo wrote any new music from Giant Leeches. In a moment, you'll see that he gets the kind of on-screen credit that makes you think he must have. Thanks to David Schechter, I was able to say a lot more about Laszlo on the Film Masters Blood Beast lecture track. Other Laszlo credits: The Amazing Mr. X, Tarzan's Magic Fountain, The Atomic Submarine, and Joe Palooka Champ. I mention the latter only because Laszlo is also in it, uncredited, playing a character named Aladar. Me being me, I just had to know what Laszlo does in the picture, what kind of character Aladar is, but it's not on that Russian site that, well, you know which one I mean. Walker's General Store, where the elite meet to eat. The elite swamp rats, that is. The swamp trash, as Sheriff Kovis calls them. On the official music cue sheet for Giant Leeches, 6 of the cues listed were written by Lou Froman and Misha, like Misha Auer, Terror, T-E-R-R. The titles are Cat's Meow, Ridin' the Cat, Cat's Blues, Rock and Roll Doggy, Blues in 3D, and Nice Evening.
You hear me, girl?
Sorry for the interruption. The honky-tonk piano and saxophone music we're hearing now, according to David Schechter, it's a safe bet that it's the Froman Tear cue that's titled Cat's Meow. Our cast of swamp rats and polecats includes Bruno Visoda as Walker.
Someday I'm going to give that she-cat a whopping she's been asking for.
Starting on the left, Michael Emmett as Cal, Joseph Hamilton as Sam, and George Cesar as Lem, the poacher from the pre-credits sequence. All 3 characters are going to die the way they were born, screaming. With the hat, Daniel White. He'll also be leeched.
Too many people. They go in the swamp, they never come out.
Why were there so many ultra-cheap sci-fi horror movies in the late 1950s? What started this voyage to the bottom of the barrel? Well, I'll tell you. I know that you know that the 1950s started with several of the major studios turning out some of the best sci-fi and sci-fi horror movies of the decade. The Thing, Day the Earth Stood Still, War of the Worlds, It Came from Outer Space, Creature from the Black Lagoon, 20,000 Leagues, etc. But by the mid-50s, the majors were backing off a little. Universal's William Alland looked at the grosses of a rival studio's much cheaper sci-fis and realized that Universal was overspending. Paramount showed George Pal the door, etc. Suddenly, most of the major studios' sci-fis weren't a heck of a lot better than AIPs, weren't any better than those of indie producers like Gramercy Pictures. Then came the next step down. the horror sci-fi field became very overcrowded as indie movie makers started shooting movies for very little money, sometimes almost none. I'm talking to you, Jerry Warren, Ronnie Ashcroft, etc. And movie theater managers who could pay XXX dollars for a well-done horror sci-fi, or just X dollars for a cheapie, would want to pay X and go for the cheapie. That was the point at which some reliable sci-fi movie producers, Ivan Tors and Sam Katzman among them, washed their hands of sci-fi, and other producers lowered the sci-fi budgets even more than they already had. Even within the sci-fi universe of Roger Corman, look at such movies as Day the World Ended, It Conquered the World, Attack of the Crab Monsters. Okay production values, some good people with recognizable names in the casts, running times of 70, 75, 80 minutes. But now, just a couple years down the road, almost everything is cheap, cheap, cheap. 60-minute running times, actors you never heard of. Interrupting myself, when Yvette Vickers prepares to go from her Japanese robe down to her leopard print undergarments, I believe that it's illegal to talk on a commentary about anything else. On the soundtrack, a jazz combo, sax, piano, bass, and maybe drums, to accentuate Liz Baby's sexuality. Talking to interviewer Barry Brown, Bruno Visoda said about Yvette, "I loved Yvette Vickers. I think Yvette Vickers was a better sex symbol than 10 Marilyn Monroes put together. She was most certainly a fine actress," unquote. Well, in the years to come, generations of monster kids felt the same way about her. For the first couple years of my interviewing career, I stuck to writers, producers, directors. But then when I started looking for actors and actresses, Yvette was at the top of my list. But the earth had swallowed her up. No one I talked to knew where to begin to look for her. But finally I got an address, and on a trip to California, I went to her house. But it was such a tiny wreck of a house, more like a 2-story shack, falling apart, the steps leading up to it falling apart, tall weeds everywhere. I couldn't believe that anyone lived there. I beat a hasty retreat, but I wrote a letter to that address telling her who I was and that I wanted to interview her, and gave the phone number of the motel where I was staying. And to my joy, she called, and she said she'd be happy to talk with me. We got together for the first time at a hamburger hamlet, I think. I could be wrong. And it was genuinely exciting to meet her and hear her stories. And we stayed in touch for the entire rest of her life. And yes, she did live in that house. And she died in that house. And maybe the house killed her. When her body was found and the authorities entered the place, it was the black mold capital of the U.S. west of the Rockies. More on that later. Getting back to what I was saying about the late 50s monster pictures getting to be breathtakingly cheap, Giant Leeches was made during this era of tightening the purse strings to the point of strangulation. It was the third of 3 movies produced by Roger Corman's brother Gene and directed by Bernard Kowalski. The first 2 were Hot Car Girl and Blood Beast. Both Hot Car Girl and Giant Leeches were written by Leo Gordon, the formidable-looking tough guy actor. In our 1985 interview, Gene Corman told me,
Leo was a very burly, tough fellow, but his background belied his looks. He was an avid reader, and he would read on many levels, and he was a very witty, interesting conversationalist. In many ways, his appearance in those tough guy roles probably worked to his disadvantage, because to have Leo walk into a story conference was somewhat intimidating. I remember on Tobruk having Arthur Hiller, who was really a very fey, gentle soul, taken aback when he met Leo. It took maybe 2 or 3 story conferences before he could come to grips with the size and bulk of Leo. The way he presented himself was intimidating.
And while we're on the subject of Gene Corman, here are Yvette Vickers' memories of working with him on Giant Leeches.
Poor Gene almost died when we were doing the scenes over at the Pasadena Arboretum. We were there late one night, in the water, and he got violently ill. He caught pneumonia. Gene was such a nice person. I thought he was so helpful, so supportive, so caring about the actors. You feel that. I remember being on TV shows where the New York people would come on the set and everybody would start shaking in their boots. It was time to shape up, shoulders back, chin up, like we were in the army. The And I thought, what are we, a bunch of trained animals or something? We are human beings. And when a producer treats you like a human being, they get a lot more out of you. I liked Gene Corman very much.
Chowing down like he's afraid someone will take the bowl away. Gene Roth as Sheriff Kovis. Eons ago, I threw away my collection of famous monsters because I really had no use for them, but first I went through each issue looking for anything of interest, and one of the best things that came out of that salvage operation was the article Vultura's Last Chapter, peppered with Roth quotes. Interrupting myself, Kovis's deputy, Morton, smoking in the blurry background, is played by Guy Bucola, who played one of this movie's two giant leeches. The Roth quotes in Famous Monsters came from his chats with, again, Barry Brown. Toward the end of Roth's life, he had a part-time job in a Hollywood drugstore, and working in a bookstore across the street and less than a block away was Brown. And Brown would occasionally visit Roth at lunchtime or when on a break. Roth said that he was an extra in the Lon Chaney Hunchback of Notre Dame. Roth would have been just out of his teens then, but didn't start working as a movie actor until the early 1940s. Roth was tall and beefy and a great villain in a lot of B pictures and serials. In the late 50s, he suddenly started popping up in sci-fi and horror cheapies with some regularity. Giant Leeches, Zombies of Moratau, Tormented, Earth vs. the Spider, and the creme de la creme, he was Igor in She-Demons. In 1976, Roth was killed by a speeding hit-and-run driver. Bernard Kowalski, 29 years old in 1958 when he directed Giant Leeches. He grew up in the business. Starting at age 4, he was an extra in Warner Brothers movies, and as a teenager, he began working with his father, who was an assistant director and production manager. Directing-wise, Bernie got his feet wet with TV, Richard Diamond, Broken Arrow, etc. Making the jump to movie director wasn't much of a jump. His first movies were for Roger and Gene Corman, made so quickly and so cheaply that the experience was probably indistinguishable from directing a TV episode. In fact, Tyler McVeigh said that to me. I asked him how he liked the rush pace of a Corman movie, and he just scoffed that it was just like TV and therefore no sweat. Regarding Giant Leeches, Kowalski told me,
"We shot all the swamp scenes at this Pasadena Arboretum, a beautiful refuge for ducks and geese. The interiors were done at the Chaplin Studios. The underwater scenes were done in a private home in Studio City. It had a private pool with a viewing glass. We would dress it up with plants and things, then bring the actors in and shoot the underwater scenes there."
31-year-old Ken Clark may have been a good choice for his role as a law enforcer, being the son of a deputy sheriff. He grew up in Ohio, married his high school sweetheart, and, against his father's wishes, moved with his family to California in hopes of becoming an actor. He pursued acting jobs, but found little success. The movies didn't want him, but the Army did. And afterwards, the blonde 6'3" Clark became a physical culture model, appearing in magazines and advertisements. He got a small, uncredited part on an episode of TV's Climax, and that led to a 20th Century Fox test and a 7-year Fox contract. But maybe the only halfway decent part he played was the hunky stew pot in South Pacific. After Fox dropped him, he did a lot of TV. He had the right look for an action series guy, but he starred in 2 pilots, Wildcatters and Brock Callahan, the latter directed by Don Siegel, and neither pilot flew. He had starring roles in only 2 Hollywood pictures, Giant Leeches and another sci-fi, the ultra-boring 12 to the Moon. In 1960, he relocated to Italy and tried his fortunes there. In doing so, he kicked all his relatives to the curb, his wife, 3 children, his sisters, and anybody else who was rustling around in his family tree. Overseas, he starred in a bunch of sword and sandal movies, spy flicks, and spaghetti westerns. After a long flurry of activity, things got sporadic. He was in Rome, just finishing shooting a TV episode, when he was cut down by a heart attack 3 days shy of his 82nd birthday.
Do you want some coffee?
I'd love some coffee. This horrible, boring 4-minute rowboat scene is putting me to sleep. One of my pet peeves, you sit down to watch a 60-minute movie thinking, well, if it's 60 minutes, it's got to be sort of fast-paced, and you find yourself watching one dead scene after another. Take out most of the Ken Clark, Jan Shepard scenes, take out the long, no-dialogue Posse and Bloodhounds scene, get Giant Leeches down to 50 or 52 minutes, and it'd go up 1 star in everybody's book, I guarantee you. Jan Shepard didn't really have a hard time getting into the acting biz. Born in Pennsylvania, she acted in high school plays, and during a trip to California to visit a cousin, she joined a theater group and never looked back. Soon she was on TV doing some religious show. Her roommate Amanda Blake did a 1953 movie called Saberjet, recommended Shepard for a role, and Shepard got it. And now Shepard was in the movies, too. There were auditions for the Nan part in Giant Leeches. She read for it, and she got it, and then learned that she was pregnant. She told the Psychotronic interviewer that Bernard Kowalski said they were going to do Leeches in 2 months, and Shepard thought that she'd still look fine. She continued, quote, "Unfortunately, 2 months became 3 months, and it wasn't until 5 months later that we started Leeches. I was running all over town finding clothes that wouldn't make me look pregnant. I had them fooled until the director asked me to do a scene in the swamp. The water was completely stagnant, dirty, and non-moving. I finally told Bernie Kowalski that I was pregnant. He agreed it wasn't a good idea for me to get in that filthy water, so he threw out the scene." An interesting shot here. The fishing poles, or whatever they are, look like bars, signifying Dave being trapped in an unhappy relationship. No, I don't really believe that. But once in a while, I like to show that I can play that horseshit film scholar game as well as anybody. I asked Yvette Vickers if she enjoyed working with Bruno Visoda.
Oh, yes. We got along very well, and he was a fine actor. I loved working with him, and we respected each other a lot. I was just heartbroken when he passed away. Barry Brown told me he had died, and I attended his funeral. I was really sad because I felt that he was one of the very good character actors of this town and should have had more credit. All of our scenes in Giant Leeches had a lot of heart and a lot of meat to them.
And outside is Dave's old pal Cal, waiting for Dave to leave for Miss Chauvy's so that he can make his move. Michael Emmett was the star of Night of the Blood Beast, gave a good performance, and I love to hate him here in Leeches. I'd have enjoyed having the opportunity to talk to Emmett, but I never knew where to start looking. A couple minutes ago, when Liz was taking off her Japanese robe and getting ready to put on her dress, I think I spotted a Groucho Marx bust on a table nearby. Maybe when I see this on Blu-ray, I'll be more sure of that. Now I see the reflection of the boom on the top of the car. Bernard Kowalski on Yvette Vickers, whom he also directed in an episode of TV's M Squad with Lee Marvin. In this sound clip, Kowalski says that when she did Giant Leeches, she was already a Playboy playmate, but actually Yvette didn't appear in Playboy until 1959.
All of us doing the show were really impressed with her, because she had been a Playboy centerfold, and we understood why. She had a gorgeous figure. She was hardworking, willing to do whatever she had to do, including some things she didn't like going underwater and being dragged around. She was a first-class trooper and a good actress, and someone that we were very happy to be working with. I could say nothing but positive things about her.
Now we've got a jazz combo on the soundtrack, dance band music. David Schechter says this is probably the cue, Cat's Blues. When I interviewed Yvette, I told her what Kowalski had said about her, that she was a trooper and so on, and she was delighted to hear it.
Bless his heart. That's very sweet of him. As I mentioned before, I know that I can overcome almost anything. There are times when you want to be sure that everybody's protecting you, and I think it's good to be upfront about things that you're a little frightened of. But in general, I'll do whatever the part requires.
Here's another scene no one needed. Jan Shepard still walks among us, by the way. As I sit here recording this, she's now 95 years old. And I hope that I haven't jinxed her and that she's still around when this Blu-ray comes out. Castle of Frankenstein's Giant Leeches review couldn't have been much shorter. Wretched, no-budget horror film, ridiculous giant leeches in Florida Everglades don't look so ridiculous to victims. When I do an audio commentary and find that I need to fill 12 seconds here and 15 seconds there, I like to read a line or two from a contemporary review. Well, I was thwarted this time. Practically no one reviewed Giant Leeches, and those who did said nothing quotable. As if Yvette Vickers isn't hot enough just standing in place, she gets a makeout scene in Leaches, and it may be even more provocative than the one she has with Handsome Harry in Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. And part of it is an extreme close-up. Yvette was a wild chick. She married for the first time in 1953, Don Prell. He was a jazz musician. By his own admission, he was a hick, and they got married in Tijuana. Coming home, they stopped in Los Angeles at a place where some of Yvette's friends were throwing a party. It was a bit much for the poor guy. This was the first time he was exposed to, quote, guys that were like ladies, and after a while, he'd had enough and left, and spent his wedding night at his parents' house. Don later bought a house for Yvette, the house she lived the rest of her life in and died in. After Yvette did a national shampoo commercial and began to think she was on her way, she decided that Don was holding her back. One day he found a note on a table, "Get out." Another Vickers memory of Giant Leeches.
A lot of it was shot at night, unintentionally. We started out shooting day for night, but we went over, and we literally ended up shooting a couple of scenes by the light of flashlights and headlights from a car. Gene kept saying, "We gotta finish these scenes today, we gotta move." So we kept going into the night with whatever light we could find.
In horror novelist Stephen King's nonfiction book On Writing, a memoir of the craft, he writes about his formative years and of being a horror movie buff as a boy, quoting, "And when I lay in bed at night under my eave, listening to the wind in the trees or the rats in the attic, it was not Debbie Reynolds as Tammy or Sandra Dee as Gidget that I dreamed of, but Yvette Vickers from Attack of the Giant Leeches or Luana Anders from Dementia 13. Never mind sweet, never mind uplifting, never mind Snow White and the 7 goddamn dwarfs. At 13, I wanted monsters that ate whole cities, radioactive corpses that came out of the ocean and ate surfers, and girls in black bras who looked like trailer trash." Here's where I would include a line from a review, if somebody had bothered to write one in 1959. 7,800 miles of places to look, but Bloodhound Dave Walker is making a beeline for Cal and Liz baby.
I know these swamps like my finger.
First husband was a no-good bum.
Yvette told me that one of her husbands tried to shove her out of a moving car, and another time he chased her with a knife. He would end every argument with, "You are not worthy of me."
He must have been a prize pig.
In a moment, Liz will say that after 2 years working in a lousy beaner, she was ready for the first guy who said a nice word to her. Huh? Liz baby worked in a beaner for 2 years and no man showed any interest in her? What was the name of the place? Adam and Steve's? Yvette talked to me about why Liz had to reveal why she became Mrs. Dave Walker.
They had to explain that. I'm sure everybody was wondering why my character was married to this big fat guy. And then when you hear the reason, it's very believable. Things like that do happen, where somebody treats you with kindness and you cannot see them as being an ugly or unattractive person. I liked that scene a lot. I was recently on a local TV show where they showed a film clip from Giant Leeches, and an artist friend of mine saw it and thought it was a Kazan movie, Baby Doll, or some real important film. And he said, "Gee, I didn't know you worked in those Tennessee Williams movies." Some of the scenes that we did came across as being real thoroughbred scenes.
2 seconds before I pull the trigger.
No point getting riled, Dave. Wasn't my fault.
Bruno Visoda, born in 1922, so he's 36 here. He had only 4 years on Ivet Vickers. Bruno was very busy in early television in Chicago, acting, writing, directing, then came to Hollywood in the early 50s. The dreamlike, no-dialogue horror film Dementia from 1955. Visoda co-produced and acted in it, and maybe did a lot more behind the scenes. Watch, if you dare, the extreme close-ups of the rich man, played by Visoda with blonde hair, as he ogles a samba dancer and gluttonously eats a chicken dinner. But after we see him in these scenes that we wish we could unsee, Visoda pays a price. The gammon shivs him with a switchblade, pushes him off a penthouse balcony, saws off his hand, and then deposits the hand in a flower girl's basket. The flower girl played by Bruno's wife, with whom he had an army of kids. Giant Leeches' Dave Walker wasn't getting none, but in real life it looks like Bruno did all right. A few years later, Bruno became a horror sci-fi regular when he fell into Roger Corman's clutches. Because of his size, he stands out in The Undead, in which he's decapitated, The Wasp Woman Drinks His Blood, War of the Satellites, A Bucket of Blood, The Haunted Palace, and a bunch of non-horror Cormans. He directed Corman's The Brain Eaters. On the downside, he also directed Invasion of the Star Creatures, and he got mixed up with Jerry Warren. Watch, if you dare, as a shirtless Bruno gets a 7-minute massage in Warren's Creature of the Walking Dead. This is one of those maddening scenes where a young couple runs away from a much older or much less healthy guy, a guy who moves at the speed of a guy pushing a Cadillac uphill. But no matter how fast the youngsters run, no matter how many times Bruno stops to fire his rifle, to yell at them, to reload, when the youngsters finally run out of gas, Bruno is right behind them. As I know you know, this tortoise and the hare stuff happens in a couple of Universal's Mummy movies. By the way, speaking of Bruno's abilities as a director, I recently read for the first time an interview with screenwriter Charles B. Griffith, conducted by somebody named Aaron W. Graham. Bruno Visoda came up, and Griffith said, Bruno was a sweetie pie. He was a really nice guy that everybody loved. He fancied himself a director. One time he went out to do a Corman picture and took one shot in one direction, then turned the camera around to shoot the guy answering. When he started to turn the camera around again, the crew quit on the spot. Bruno said, "What did I do?" He just didn't know. Griffith didn't describe the situation very well. What I think he was saying was that Visoda was directing a back-and-forth dialogue scene between two people, and he intended to get one person's first line, turn the camera around and get the second person's reply, turn the camera around again to get the first guy's second line, turn the camera... No. Not the way it's done. Even I know that, 3,000 miles from Hollywood.
Come on, keep going.
Dave, please, you gotta listen.
Some impassioned acting in this scene. Dave standing over them Grim Reaper-like as Cal tries to kick Liz baby to the curb, and Liz responds by giving him a face full of saliva. Unfortunately, she shoots her whole saliva wad the first time. The second time is not as impressive. One of the drive-in movie devotees who haunts the classic horror film board wrote of Liz baby, "I hope that connoisseur of white trash tootsies, Erskine Caldwell, caught her performance as Liz Walker in Attack of the Giant Leeches. Forget Faye Spain or Tina Louise. Yvette's smoking hot Bayou Babe was to the little acre born."
It was hard work. That arboretum does have a very swampy, jungle-like atmosphere. You felt like this was the real thing. So yes, there were some uncomfortable moments, especially when Bruno Visoda forced us to wade backwards into the swamp. I know I looked scared in that scene, and I probably really was. But I have to give Gene Corman credit again. He was waiting with the crew there on the sidelines with army blankets and brandy to keep us warm and to try and keep us healthy.
You think you learned enough to stay away from a woman, Cal?
It's well known that only 2 Leech costumes were made, so every time I watch the movie, I think that there are only 2 Leech monsters. The movie's even creepier if you tell yourself there might be 10 or 20 or 50. No one in the movie ever tries to put a number on how many there are. It's kind of senseless to think if atomic energy is mutating swamp creatures, there'd be just 2. As you'll hear later, the guys inside the Leech costumes got the jobs because they agreed to make the Leech costumes, the same way Chris Robinson got to play the Beast from Haunted Cave by agreeing to make the Beast from Haunted Cave costume. Corman had come a long way down, from hiring Paul Blaisdell to make his monsters in early pictures, to getting a kid, Chris Robinson, to make the Haunted Cave suit, by getting a basketball player to make the Leech suits. The costumes were a raincoat-like material that had lots of quote-unquote suction cups glued to them, and inside there had to be some kind of framework so that the costume held some sort of shape. So the raincoat material went around chicken wire. If, like me, you aren't quite sure what chicken wire is, Google up an image. It's wire netting of hexagonal mesh. As soon as you see the image, you'll recognize it as something you've seen any number of times. But the trouble with chicken wire is, it's hard to work with it without occasionally getting cut. And working inside of chicken wire, sometimes underwater, surely guaranteed lots of little cuts.
That's why you chased her through the swamp with a shotgun. Come on, Walt.
Now it's Bruno Visoda's turn for a giant close-up. I wasn't even going to mention this. I'm not sure I like having to mention this, but we're about to start another stretch of nothing happening, and I need to talk about something, so... For most of the umpty-ump years that I interviewed old-timers for Fangoria, I wrote about half of the video reviews in each issue, and boy, did they give me a lot of junk to look at. But I was getting paid, and I had a years younger nephew who liked getting advance peeks at new direct-to-video movies, so I gritted my teeth. I don't know if I ever gritted them any harder than when I watched a 2009 remake of Attack of the Giant Leeches. I don't even think it qualifies as a movie. It was shot with a handheld video camera in some process that made it appear that every other frame was missing. It looked more like a home movie than anything that could come out on video, and that people would be expected to pay for. Sometimes they'd show the Leaches Lake, and it'd look like it was a mile across, but in other scenes it was played by a puddle, maybe 15 feet across. Fast forward for a few seconds if you don't want to hear this. It's depressing just to talk about how rancid this thing was. Interrupting myself, Dave Walker finally becomes a swinger. One wonders where he got such a stout length of rope. And, by the way, I've always wondered,
how did he get up there so high?
By the way, the deputy was again Guy Bucola, one of the Leech actors. In the 2009 remake of Giant Leeches, the scenes of the abducted people in the Leeches grotto were filmed on the grass in what looks like somebody's front yard in broad daylight. And this was my favorite. One of the grotto victims floats up out of the water, breaks the surface, spitting water and gasping for air like crazy. But we're later told that he'd been dead for days when he surfaced. I gave the 2009 Leeches 1 star, Fangoria's lowest rating, and wished that I was allowed to use negative numbers. When Barry Brown interviewed Bruno Visoda, the actor bluntly let him know what he thought of the Giant Leeches costumes. The Giant Leeches, as a picture, wasn't bad at all. The only thing I found fault with was the monsters. One of the things that separates the men from the boys in this business is knowing that if you're making a monster picture, you'd better make a perfect monster, or as near perfect as possible. A producer cannot allow himself to get trapped in a financial situation where he lets the zippers on the monster suits show. So it came to pass with the Giant Leeches. Ed Nelson, who was going to be in the picture, was delegated to making the monster suits. As he started to make them, he was hired for another movie and had to relinquish the making of the suits to someone else. So when the monster suits were finally made and put on the swimmers, who were wearing air tanks, these suits were rubber-looking things with octopus-like suction cups all over them to make them look like monsters, the suits didn't fit over the air tanks. They split and had to be pinned together with paper clips and sewn with needle and thread. And they looked so bad and phony that in the final cutting of it, as in the Brain Eaters, you could only take a 6-frame or a 12-frame cut, wham, show the monsters, and cut away to show somebody running away from them. If you took one close look, you'd laugh your head off. You see air tanks sticking out of the monster suits, you know? It's the same thing as Attack of the Crab Monsters. You see this giant monster moving towards you with human feet underneath it, and that was Giant Leeches. If you get a man who doesn't have a track record of making monster suits, you're taking a great chance. At this point, Barry Brown said to him, "You could at least put some money into monster suits," and Visoda came back with, "Whatever it takes. Everything else comes after that. Whatever it takes to make a monster suit, the monster is your star. Whatever it takes to make a suit, spend it, because that's your star." The last time I spoke to Roger Corman, it was about Creature from the Haunted Sea, and the next to last question I ever asked him was about the subpar quality of his late 50s monsters. I mentioned the halfway elaborate monsters in his early sci-fis, made by Paul Blaisdell, and then pointed out that in the late 50s, he really began skimping in the monster department. The Wasp Woman was Susan Cabot in a not very good mask. The Beast from Haunted Cave was a junky suit made by a kid. The giant leeches looked like guys in heavy-duty contractor trash bags. And then the ridiculous-looking creature from the Haunted Sea. Roger instantly, cheerfully came out with the response that he wasn't skimping. It was the fact that he thought it was time to try something different. Well, going from good crowd-pleasing monsters to disappointing, laughable ones, yeah, that's something different, all right. When I talked to him that last time, he was 98 and pretty sick, so I let him get away with that answer. I didn't challenge it. Coincidentally, in this movie set in Florida, we have, in the back of the boat, actor Daniel White, who may have been a Floridian through and through. He was born there and went back there after he left pictures. If you're a B-movie fan, you know his rat-like face from any number of westerns where he played baddies. To me, he looks a little like Tom Tyler, once Tyler got to the age where he went from playing good guys to bad guys. Not much horror or sci-fi on White's resume, although you might remember him as the Deputy Elmer in Lugosi's Voodoo Man and as one of the crew members stranded with the dinosaurs on Unknown Island. He ran away from his Florida home at 14 to play in tent shows, minstrel shows, and vaudeville shows throughout the South. In the mid-30s, he hankered to go to Hollywood, so with his family, he began traveling cross-country. But the trip took forever because every time he ran out of money, he had to take a job wherever he was at that time to make a few bucks and be able to continue west. The sound made by the Leeches. I always thought it might be a turkey gobble or a pigeon cooing, sped up or slowed down. But my pal Dave Hodge of the Louisville, Kentucky Zoo gave a listen, and he votes no on both of those. He feels certain that it's a mechanically generated sound, a bubbler, or some similar type of machine. When a leech lets out a roar, that, Dave says, is the sound of a wildcat, most likely a bobcat or a mountain lion. Attack of the Giant Leeches pièce de résistance, the notorious Cave of Horrors scene, described to a stomach-turning T by Larry Blameyer.
As a monster kid, staying up past one's bedtime felt like forbidden territory. Add to that certain movies that would show up with things a little darker, a little queasier than we're used to, and then it becomes even more forbidden. Are we even supposed to be seeing this? Does the TV station know they're running this? No scenes reflected this more than the legendary grotto sequences in Attack of the Giant Leeches, starring everyone's favorite listless ensemble, the barely alive blood-drained players, also known as the Leech Buffet. The sight and sound of these pathetic souls lolling and groaning and occasionally screaming to the tune of the leech's nauseating bubbling gurgle is forever burned into the glazed eyeballs and stunned ears of monster kids craving that grotesque unknown. Right up there with such half-dead human meals as the It the Terror victims and what I call the Beast from Haunted Cave web snacks. The crudity and limitations of the leech monster costumes didn't matter, which shows you that context is everything. Their bubbling motorboat sound was as unsettling as the rapidly speeding up heartbeat and slurping of the fiends without a face. And when the poor people float to the top, they are easily the creepiest underwater victims since Night of the Hunter, and then some. Has anything so low budget had such a lasting impact?
In our interview, Gene Corman did a nice job of analyzing why parts of giant leeches are as disturbing as they are.
It just seemed that in that kind of film, you had to have 2 or 3 memorable moments, scenes that the audience would go away thinking about, talking about. Somehow, when you place people in jeopardy with leeches, with things that are distasteful, and then combine that with water, you somehow touch a very Freudianly responsive chord in people.
The Leeches grotto scenes and the steamy, for 1959, subplot with Cal and Liz. To me, they're all a little surprising to find in a movie of this era, made for kids and teens. I asked Bernard Kowalski if they had any trouble getting the Leeches' blood-sucking scenes past the censors.
Not really. In those days, Roger and Gene Corman would deal with the censors. They were very effective. Total film buffs who knew what the censors had allowed other people to do. They would be about the finest representatives in that area that you could have. They would know what limitations had been imposed on most of the shows that were out, and then they would fight for parity.
I went online to see if the Arboretum was still around, and if so, if it had a website. And it does. and I was happy to see that it included a timeline from which I could maybe glean a few interesting tidbits. Interrupting myself, we watched the searchers and the dog in the foreground, and it's easy not to notice the boat passing in the background. Giant leeches, like Night of the Blood Beast, also photographed by John Nicholas, regularly has easy-to-miss action in the background, which, if you do notice it, is a real nice extra-mile touch for a low-budget movie. Well, the Arboretum's website timeline is 2 miles long. It begins, I kid you not, in 500 BC. I looked for interesting tidbits without success, until I couldn't take it anymore. So, in a nutshell, the property was purchased by the state of California and the county of Los Angeles jointly in 1947, 111 acres, so that they could create an arboretum there. In 1953, 2 additional parcels of land were purchased, bringing the Arboretum up to its present 127 acres. It formally opened to the public in 1955. I'm sure it's all very pretty and peacocks still run around, but looking at the list of activities there, it sounds like kind of a typical California spooky joint. For example, you can take sound baths, where you're bathed in sound waves through the use of singing bowls and gongs, and meditate as you're awed at the physicality of the singing bowls, leading to a better awareness of your body and its surroundings and leading to joy. From the website, bring your own mat. If it's all the same to you, I think I'd have a much better time hanging out in Walker's General Store with Dave and Porky and Liz Baby. On the IMDb is a list of 151 movies and TV shows that, the IMDb claims, were shot at the Arboretum, and probably most of them were. I know from my own research that Zombies of Moritau was partly shot there, probably the zombies in the water, and also the Cyclops. In 1987, one of the stars of the Cyclops, Gloria Talbot, told me about working at the Arboretum. There was a scene in the jungle that we shot at the Arboretum. James Craig and I are chased by a giant lizard, and we run into a pond. We tried it once, and we kept running on top of the pond. And we all realized that there was at least 20 years of duck shit, cement hard, forming a surface that went out a good 10 feet. And, I swear to God, they yelled, "Cut out a piece of the duck shit so we can get the actors in." I actually sat there and watched them bring out a chainsaw and hack out a big area for James Craig and me to wade in, where the duck shit was still floating around in pieces. I'm amazed neither of us got salmonella. I mean, it was horrendous. And I thought to myself, this is glamour? This is fame and fortune? I just wanted to go home. Unquote. Do you still want to go to the Arboretum? 301 North Baldwin Avenue, Arcadia, California, and bring your own chainsaw. Bring your own mat. My pal Dave Hodge tells me these are water spaniels, often used for duck hunting, and therefore just the right dogs for a hunt like this. Rowing up to the bank and scampering up to join our other players, a character named Evans, who was one of the Walker's General Store lollygaggers, chortling at the Poacher's Wild Story About a Monster. The actor Ross Sterling, who played the title role in Night of the Blood Beast, and, in this movie, in addition to playing Evans, he plays a title role as one of the Leaches. Getting back to talking about my friendship with Yvette Vickers. Our interview ran in Fangoria magazine. I got her to go to a FanX convention in the Baltimore area and a Chiller Theater in New Jersey, and after that, she was often running on her own, going to autograph shows, giving interviews, and so on. And she kept in touch with me always. Phone calls, letters, Christmas cards. I've got a big fat file of everything. She didn't trust everybody, so I was flattered that she trusted me. I had fun doing an Attack of the 50-Foot Woman audio commentary with her. But slowly, she started to change. I always thought there was a touch of paranoia in her, and, being a licensed doctor, I recognized that it was getting worse. And now, many times when she called, her speech was slurred. 2005, 6, 7, somewhere around there, I got to admit, when she'd call, I'd be awful slow about returning the call, because every call was the same call. How are you, darling? I had to change my number again. I've still got people calling and hanging up. I saw a car slow down on my street, so I called the police. I'm working on my cabaret act. People think they know me, but they don't know me. There are a lot of people in this town spreading stories about me that are not true. The same record over and over. I'd just recline on my couch or sit back in my desk chair and close my eyes and listen for 25 or 30 minutes, and then I'd knock on the desk and say somebody was at the door to get her off the phone. I liked her tremendously for the first 15, 16 years, always did whatever I could for her, but then she got to be too much of a drinker and a Debbie Downer. More on Yvette later.
Stubborn pighead?
You said it, Steve, not me. People are disappearing into the swamp left and right. Obviously, they're being killed, but Steve thinks the spotted owls, or whatever, are more important. Now, that said, Steve should not have confidence that Dr. Grayson knows how to find the one spot in these trackless wetlands to set off an explosion that'll bring up the bodies. Come to think of it, how does Dr. Grayson know where to set off the blast? Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and enjoy it. I think this might be one of the few interiors in this movie where no one's smoking. The cast of Night of the Blood Beast went through a pack a day also.
Couple of days, why?
Oh, nothing. Take care of yourself, Steve.
When you're audio commentating a movie about giant leeches terrorizing a swamp, you kind of hesitate to nitpick at little plot holes. But nitpick is my middle name. In about 30 seconds, Dr. Grayson's dynamite will go off, and in about 45 seconds, the bodies of Cal, Porky, and Sam will appear on the surface of the water. In a later post-autopsy scene, Dr. Grayson will say that all three had been drained of every drop of blood. When Cal rose to the surface, he had been dead for about 3 days, Porky and Sam a bit less than 3 days. Well, my question then is, why are these completely bloodless, dead for 3 days men so fidgety? I love the bubbling water in the grotto scenes. There's got to be dry ice in there. Getting back to Yvette Vickers saying all the same things every time she phoned me. One time she called with a news story that caught my attention. According to Yvette, she'd gone to a Western film festival in Victorville, California, went to dinner with some fans, and the next thing she knew, she was waking up in her room the next morning, and there was blood here and there. She said she'd obviously been given a date rape drug at dinner, and after that, she didn't know what happened. Of course, I was sympathetic without believing a word of it. And down the line, I checked with someone else who was there, and the reality was a bit different. She did go to dinner with actor Greg Palmer and a magazine publisher in the hotel restaurant, and she got crazy drunk. Started messing around with some other guy in the restaurant, and Palmer and the publisher couldn't control her. Somehow she fell down and bloodied herself up. She later cooked up the story she told me. But who knows? Maybe she thought it was true. I think it was at that point that she 86'd herself out of the film festival loop. I'm sure word got around about her antics. And who needs an old celeb who gets stupid drunk and raises hell in the hotel restaurant and injures herself and afterwards tells people that she might have been raped? Now comes the part of the story that quote-unquote everybody knows, even if it's the only thing they know about Yvette Vickers. Susan Strong was one of Yvette's neighbors. Susan was neighborly, even though Yvette maybe wasn't, and Susan got concerned when she saw Yvette's mail piled up and turning yellow. It probably took a while, but eventually her curiosity got the better of her, and she came knocking on the door of Yvette's tumble-down house. The door was barricaded shut, but Susan easily got in. The place would have given the Collier brothers nightmares. There was piled up junk everywhere. She navigated around, up the stairs, at one point went through a wall where the drywall was gone, etc., and started looking around the upstairs. And upstairs, on the floor, in a room that was hot because a space heater was going, was some clothes covered with lots of fungus and what Susan assumed was a wig. But upon closer examination, it was Yvette. Susan let out a scream and, covered in cobwebs, fled the house, called the cops. How decomposed was Yvette? Looking at what was left, you couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, face up or face down. A cop told Susan it was the worst decomposition he'd ever seen. The 56 pounds of Yvette were removed from the premises and, because it was unrecognizable as a man or a woman, initially listed in records as a Doe. Doe as in John Doe, Jane Doe. Initially, it was thought that Yvette had been dead almost a year, but it turned out to be more like 8 months. Susan was the only person the cops could find who knew Yvette even a little, so she ended up getting some inside information. And her experience affected her. She wanted to know how something like this could happen, how a person could end up so friendless, such a recluse, that many months could elapse with no one raising an alarm. She got a hold of Yvette's address book and began calling everybody in it to let them know what had happened and to ask them some questions. I was one of the ones she called. That's how I was able to post about Yvette's death on the Classic Horror Film Board before the news broke anywhere else. If Yvette's heart trouble had caused her to die in public or in a hospital, I'm sure her passing would have been mentioned nowhere but in Variety and Classic Images. But between her mummification and the fact that she'd been such a hottie and a Playboy playmate, stories ran everywhere, even multiple-page stories in such magazines as Entertainment Weekly. The Giant Leeches' Jan Shepard was interviewed by Entertainment Weekly and quoted in that piece, and I was too. Kinda. The quotes they ascribed to me, I read them and said to myself, I never said that. They had me saying I first met her the day I went to her house. Well, that didn't happen. As I mentioned earlier, I took one look at that hazmat house of horrors and...
I ran as little Jimmy Grimaldi had run the other day.
Susan Strong wrote a piece for a Benedict Canyon newsletter, hoping it would prevent another tragedy like Yvette's. There was a memorial for Yvette. Her half-brother was there, even though he never gave Susan Strong the idea that he overflowed with love for Yvette. When Susan got home from the memorial, she says that, at the half-brother's directive, a junk-hauling crew had cleaned out Yvette's house. What the crew didn't take away, they threw outside and repeatedly ran over with a bobcat, so that no one else would want to take it. Some of Yvette's belongings were left in the street, including a scrapbook and an album of arty black and white photos of young Yvette on a beach. The house immediately became part of a haunted Hollywood tour. The New York Daily News ran an online story on Yvette's death, how Susan found the body, etc., and below the story were a bunch of readers' comments. The usual things. I liked their movies. How sad, etc. One comment about Yvette's death made me laugh out loud, and I just had to send a link to Susan. Quote, "The neighbor did it." Susan got a kick out of that, but there was another comment she liked even better. The story had mentioned the space heater that ran the many months Yvette was dead, and one reader asked, "Does anyone know the brand?"
No.
In our interview, I asked director Bernard Kowalski if he was happy with the Leech costumes, and he used the opportunity to give a shout-out to the guys who played the Leeches.
The two actors playing the Leeches were Guy Baccola, a basketball player from UCLA, and Ross Sterling, a young man that had done stunts on Boots and Saddles, and played the alien in Blood Beast. These two fellows were forced to build the Leech costumes in order to get the job. They were paid money for the building of them, but the job did come with costumes. They were made out of cheap rubberized raincoat material, sewed in a cape-like form. Very little money was spent on them. They were always tearing, so as a result, they did have a number of problems in trying to maintain the look. Of course, when we'd go underwater, that was difficult, because they'd get air pockets in the suit. It was the best that we could do with the time that we had. Unfortunately, on a 7-day feature like that, you don't have an awful lot of time once you've started to make these kinds of corrections. To go back to your original question, were you happy with them? In no way were they totally satisfactory at all.
The little guy playing Ken Clark's diver buddy. I get a kick out of the fact that he had such a tiny part and just a few lines, but he blew what was practically his first line. His character, Mike, walks up to Ken Clark and calls him Mike. I asked Yvette Vickers if she remembered her first impressions of the Leech costumes. She laughed and then responded,
Well, I guess the same as everybody else's. They looked like guys in plastic bags. Of course, I'd seen the divers who played the Leeches in their black scuba suits, so I knew who they were and I wasn't afraid of them. But I must admit that in the cave scenes, when they crawled up to us and began to suck our blood, that I was really affected by that. A lot of people have told me that they saw giant leeches when they were 10 or 12 years old, and that they were really scared by those cave scenes. And I can understand that. The Blob, that's my nightmare. But again, when I first saw the leech actors on the set, I just thought they were not very well made. And those guys did have a little trouble in the water. They had to knock themselves out trying to make it look believable.
Tyler McVeigh, on the right, struck me as the kind of guy who, if he couldn't say something nice, wouldn't say anything. But I nevertheless tried to get him to poke some fun at the leech costumes. He hemmed and hawed for a few seconds, but finally came out with what I thought was the politest put-down possible. He said, "Let's put it this way. I didn't think they were going to fool anybody." One thing I keep forgetting to mention, all the shots taken through the window of the private swimming pool, couldn't somebody have taken a minute and wiped the algae off the glass? The algae on the glass makes it so obvious that the underwater action is taking place on the other side of a window. Yvette talked to me about the upcoming death of Liz Baby.
The underwater shots of the dead bodies floating up toward the surface were filmed in somebody's swimming pool. It would have been pretty hard to get those shots out in the muddy waters of the Arboretum. Of course, when my body surfaced and the guys pulled me up into the rowboat, we were shooting at the Arboretum. I remember that everybody was watching over me then because I couldn't swim and I was afraid of the water.
Giant leeches came along at a time in AIP history when they were starting to release what they called the blockbuster exploitation pictures: Horrors of the Black Museum, Circus of Horrors, House of Usher. But according to James H. Nicholson, the company wouldn't lose sight of its bread-and-butter market. As he prepared to unleash a bucket of blood and giant leeches as a Halloween '59 double bill, Nicholson said, "These type films aren't so hot in the big cities, but you do well with them in the small towns and drive-ins." Giant Leeches was released in England as Demons of the Swamp.
You sure you don't want me to go down and finish it off for you, Steve?
No, thanks, Mike. I think I hurt it pretty bad.
Careful now. Anything hurts 10 times as dangerous.
In this scene, Dr. Grayson speculates that the giant leeches might be mutations somehow spawned by the atomic energy used by Cape Canaveral, which he says is in their proximity. I take a backseat to no man in my ignorance of the demographics of Brevard County, Florida, the Space Coast, as it's nicknamed, in 1958, but somehow I don't picture space scientists getting their breakfast sandwiches at Walker's General Store. But then again, I wouldn't have believed the giant leeches could take over Brevard County. So what do I know? Don't forget to check out the Giant Leeches trailer. There's a long, lingering close-up of a leech. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it's extremely blurry. We get a much better look at the two leeches capsizing Porky and Sam's boat, and there's more footage of Liz battling a leech, her hands very noticeably spattered with blood. It's kind of fun to know that movies like this go together like jigsaw puzzles. In a minute, we'll see Liz drop into the water in the grotto, which is Yvette Vickers on a set at Chaplin Studios. When we see her body floating up past the camera, Yvette was in somebody's swimming pool. And when she surfaces, that's Yvette at the Arboretum. Roger Corman died in May 2024, and my Night of the Blood Beast audio commentary on the other disc in this set was my first time commentating a Corman movie since he passed. I thought about dedicating it to him, for whatever that'd be worth. Nothing. But I felt it'd be a nice thing to do. But then I remembered that half the commentary was Blood Beast writer Martin Varno calling Corman names and calling him a crook, etc., and I thought, nah, let me dedicate Leeches instead. Corman had to have had literally thousands of interviewers in his life, so I do not flatter myself that he remembered me, who called him once in a blue moon. I telephone interviewed him many times, but always months apart, sometimes probably a year or more apart. So Roger Corman did not know me, but every time we talked, he was so outstandingly nice, and what I especially liked, I was able to jog his memory and get him to tell me things about some of his oldies that he'd never told before in his countless interviews or in his autobiography. I want to tell two Roger Corman stories here. Story 1. At some monster movie convention in New Jersey, I think it was a Monster Palooza, I was asked to moderate a panel of, I forget who, Roger Corman, and maybe Hazel Court, and maybe Caroline Munro. There were 4 or 5 of them. A bunch of my friends were there, and they all wanted to go to dinner at such and such a time, but I wouldn't be able to go with them because of the panel. Well, my friends changed the dinner time. They would wait for me to moderate the panel so that I could go too. And I did moderate the panel, and everything went smoothly, and as the audience was still applauding the celebs, I was off the stage quick as a hiccup, and joining my friends, and speed walking out of the auditorium and down the hotel hallway, walking toward the exit to go to dinner. My friends and I had to have been walking 20, 30 seconds. We had to have gone the equivalent of a city block when there was a hand on my shoulder, and it was Corman, who, just a little out of breath, told me I'd done a great job moderating and shook my hand and thanked me. And with that, he turned around and started back toward the event room. I'm sure he didn't know me from Adam. I'm sure he didn't know that I'd telephone interviewed him in the past. He just wanted to thank the guy who did a nice job moderating. He saw me take off, and he must have run, in his 80s then, I guess, to catch me and tell me that. Who does that? Story 2. Several months ago, I phoned and asked Roger's assistant if I could talk with him about Creature from the Haunted Sea for the film Masters Blu-ray, and I was told yes. But then Roger got sick, and the interview kept getting delayed. The assistant apologetically notified me about each delay and gave me an update on him, health-wise. Eventually, when I started to get the idea that he was very sick, I told the assistant, or I told Roger's wife Julie, I forget which, let's forget it, I don't want to bother him. But Roger had made a commitment to me. He said he'd talk to me about Creature from the Haunted Sea, and he was determined to do it. At one point, I got a call from him from his car as he was being taken to a doctor for an emergency visit. His voice was so raspy, he was hard to understand. And again, I was promised I'd get the interview. Jiminy Christmas, the guy was 98 and maybe dying, but it seemed like half his attention was going to his health problems, and the other half was going to some idiot, me, that he'd promised a Creature from the Haunted Sea interview to, and so far he hadn't been able to deliver. And I did get the interview after he got home from that emergency doctor's visit. Do people get any more considerate? So to my mind, Roger Corman was one of the nicest celebs I ever interviewed. Rest in peace. Although the idea of Roger Corman resting doesn't seem like anything that could ever happen. In a few moments, after our heroes have departed, we'll see ripples on the water, get a glimpse of a leech just breaking the surface, hear the bubbler noise. Could this be the first monster movie which lets you know at the end that the monsters were not all destroyed, that there's more trouble in store for the human race? Hundreds of monster movies have ended this way in recent decades. It's become a terribly boring cliche, but could this have been the first time? For their help with this commentary, thank you, Robert Kokai, Larry Blameyer, Jennifer Blair, Dave Hodge, the Mighty Weaver art players, and from the cast and crew of Attack of the Giant Leeches, Yvette Vickers, Tyler McVeigh, Bernard Kowalski, Gene Corman, and Roger Corman. Thank you for listening.